Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. My name is Mike Gaudette and today's video is the first of a new series that I'm going to be putting out where I take a year and I walk you through my 5 favorite albums that were released from that year. Since 2020, I've been listening to a lot of different albums and doing a lot of deep dives on a variety of different artists and genres of music, and I've been trying to listen to about 250 to 300 albums per year, and a lot of people will ask me what some of my favorite albums are, and I figured this series would be a perfect way of sharing some of my favorite records with you and hopefully turning you on to a handful of new albums that you haven't heard of before. So for today's episode number 1, we're going to be starting out with the year 1965, which was a pivotal year for 60s music, which saw the emergence of so many great artists and produced so many great albums. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums from 1965, starting with number 5. Okay, coming in at number 5, we have the self-titled debut studio album from Scottish folk musician Bert Janch. This is an absolutely amazing acoustic guitar and vocal album that I would consider to be pretty underrated. There are definitely some people that know about this album, and it will pop up from time to time on top 60s album lists on the internet, but the majority of people that I mentioned Bert Janch to seem to have never heard of him, and when it comes to acoustic folk music, this is about as good as it gets, in my opinion. The album has 15 songs, and the compositions are incredible. It's filled with so many beautiful melodies and really colorful chord movements. Bert's guitar playing in particular, I think, is very underrated, especially for the 60s. He's doing some very impressive and virtuosic finger-picking patterns, and a lot of stuff that I think was pretty unheard of for the mid-60s. And his sense of harmony is very adventurous, and he's utilizing a lot of really unorthodox chord voicings and chord movements that you really don't hear very much in folk music from that period. The album features 9 vocal tracks and 6 instrumentals, and the instrumentals are a really great way of showcasing his very impressive guitar playing, and the vocal songs are all just absolutely amazing. I don't think there's a wasted track anywhere in this album. My personal favorite is Needle of Death, which is a very sad tribute song to his friend and fellow folk singer Buck Polly, who had died from a drug overdose. And my other 2 favorites would have to be I Have No Time and Running From Home. So if you haven't heard this album before, I would highly recommend it, especially if you are a fan of acoustic folk music. This album is very stripped down. It's just vocals and guitar. So check it out for sure if you're a fan of that style. I think, like I said, it's about as good as it gets when it comes to that genre of music, and it's got some seriously impressive guitar playing. So Bert Janch's self-titled album is my number 5. Now on to number 4. Alright, coming in at number 4, I've got Rubber Soul by the Beatles. This one is probably not a huge surprise to anybody. Regarded as a Beatles classic and a breakthrough album for them, in my opinion, from Rubber Soul and onward is when the Beatles put out the best music of their entire discography. The songwriting started to reach completely new levels, and while I do think it started a little bit on the previous album Help, I think Rubber Soul was really the album that catapulted them to new levels of creativity and songwriting. I think the compositions are top-notch from front to back. As an album, it's got a really great pacing to it, and this was an album that really shifted the way that people thought about making albums, where they really put much more of a focus on having really solid, consistent tracks all throughout the album, rather than focusing more on putting out really strong singles. And it's got a really great blending of different styles, mixing pop, folk rock, raga rock, baroque pop, and a little bit of funk as well. And it showcases really great songwriting from John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. It spawned countless Beatles classics like Drive My Car, Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man, Michelle, and In My Life, but I also think that some of the B-sides are just as strong on here, my personal favorite being Girl, written by John Lennon, and a couple of other noteworthy ones for me are Think For Yourself, written by George Harrison, and I'm Looking Through You, written by Paul McCartney. So an incredible Beatles album. It's not my number 1 favorite album of their discography, and if you are interested in a more in-depth analysis of their entire discography and how I rank it. I've done a video going through the entire Beatles discography, and I made a tier list of it. You can find that linked in the comments in my tier list playlist if you're interested in that. But would easily make my top 5 favorite Beatles albums, and a pivotal album in their discography that really opened the door for a creative explosion that we would see play out more and more throughout the remainder of their discography. So that's it for my number 4. Now on to number 3. Okay, coming in at number 3 is the Beach Boys Today, and anybody who has been a fan of my channel for some time knows that I am a huge Beach Boys fan. They are one of my favorite bands easily, and this album is a contender for my top 2, maybe top 3 favorite Beach Boys albums. I think it is absolutely incredible, and similar to what I said about Rubber Soul being a pivotal breakthrough album for the Beatles, I would say the exact same thing about this album for the Beach Boys, and I think this was the first Beach Boys album where you could hear that it was a very clear prerequisite to Pet Sounds. You could tell that something magical was, happening within their songwriting. We have Brian Wilson on production, and his songwriting is really starting to enter some new territories and get a lot more artsy and enter some Baroque pop territories with these really rich and lush instrumentations and orchestrations. And it's a very interesting album because it's got two sides that contrast each other a lot, but they also complement each other very nicely. Side 1 is much more in that classic, pop and rock Beach Boys sort of realm with classic hits like Do You Want to Dance, When I Grow Up to Be a Man, Help Me Rhonda, and Dance, 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 all of which are amazing songs. And for side 1, my personal 2 favorites would be Good to My Baby and When I Grow Up to Be a Man. And I think side 1 is very strong, but when side 2 comes on, that's really where the magic starts happening for me. And that's where we really start to hear this new sound of the Beach Boys and this new very artsy and experimental side of Brian Wilson that's just so beautiful and produced some of my favorite Beach Boys songs of the mid-60s. There are 4 tracks on side 2 in particular that I think are just absolute perfection, with Please Let Me Wonder, which is one of my favorite Beach Boys songs, as well as Kiss Me Baby, She Knows Me Too Well, and In the Back of My Mind, which is one of my all-time favorite songs to feature Dennis Wilson on lead vocals. And I will say, side 2 does have one song that I'm not crazy about. There's a cover of a song called I'm So Young, which is more in that doo-wop sort of territory. And it's interesting because I'm not a huge fan of that song, but the other 4 tracks that are on that side are just so unbelievably incredible that it really doesn't take away from the album very much for me. And I'm sure all of us have certain albums like that where almost the entire album is perfect, but then there's that one song that you're not crazy about. But usually if the remainder of the tracks are really, really strong, then it doesn't affect the album very much. And for me, this album is a perfect example of that. But this is the 8th album of their discography, and up to this point, I think this is hands down the most creative and beautiful music that Brian Wilson has produced to date. And the way they balance out side 1 and side 2, contrasting the more straight ahead pop rock sort of feels with the more artsy, new kind of adventurous territories, I think is a very effective choice because they're still giving those classic Beach Boys fans what they want on side 1 while still incorporating some more, adventurous sort of chord movements and harmonic territories on some of the songs like When I Grow Up to Be a Man, which opens up on a very interesting chord. But then side 2, like I said, gives us that creative blowout and really does a great job of getting the listener ready for some of the incredible Beach Boys albums that were to follow it, with the big one obviously being Pet Sounds. But even after Pet Sounds, we saw some really, really incredible Beach Boys albums being produced in the later part of the 60s. So like I said, one of my favorite Beach Boys albums, and again, I have a whole video breaking down all of the Beach Boys albums and ranking them. If you're interested in checking that out, you can look at the tier list playlist, which is linked in the description of this video. And yeah, that's my number 3 favorite album from 1965. Now on to number 2. All right, coming in at number 2, we have a live album by Wes Montgomery and the Wynton Kelly Trio titled Smokin' at the Half Note. Anybody who is a fan of jazz guitar should be well aware of this album. It is pretty much mutually regarded in all circles as one of the best jazz guitar albums of all time. Wes Montgomery is inarguably one of the best and most influential jazz guitar players of all time, and in my opinion, this album is one of the best piece of works that he put out in his lifetime. In addition to Wes's incredible guitar playing, we also have the powerhouse lineup of Wynton Kelly on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums, who were the rhythm section for Miles Davis from 1959 to 1963, so about as good of a rhythm section as you could possibly ask for. And the album consists of 5 songs, and every single song on here is perfect. It opens up with a 13-minute Miles Davis track titled No Blues, which kicks things off absolutely perfectly with an almost 6-minute long solo from Wes, where he takes you through the really impressive single note stuff and then some octaves and some chord soloing. The perfect introduction to everything great that Wes's playing has to offer, and Wynton Kelly picks right up and delivers an incredible solo of his own. And the remainder of the album delivers 4 more beautiful songs with 2 ballads that are standards with If You Could See Me Now and What's New, in addition to a Sam Jones original titled Unit 7 and a Wes Montgomery original titled 4 on 6, both of which are considered classics in the jazz standards repertoire at this point. If I had to pick a favorite track on here, it would probably be a tie between Unit 7 and 4 on 6. 4 on 6 is just one of Wes's greatest compositions. It's got such a cool bass line. It's got a really great hits, and his solo is absolutely incredible. And same thing with Unit 7. It's just a really great composition, great feel changes between sections, and everybody's solos on both of these songs are just absolutely incredible. And another thing that I think is really great about this album is it's a really great example of how guitar and piano can work off of one another in a musical setting, because oftentimes in a jazz setting, it's not always the easiest to pair guitar and piano together because you got 2 chordal instruments, and a lot of times they do clash. But the way that Wes and Wynton work off of each other and, leave space and come in at the appropriate times is really a great demonstration throughout this record of how those 2 instruments can really work off of one another in a very effective way. And I think this record is a great tool for teaching that to guitar players and piano players who are looking to explore that sort of instrumentation. So like I said, anybody who is a fan of jazz guitar who has not heard this album, you need to listen to this as soon as possible because it's one of the most classic jazz guitar albums of all time and is regarded as one of the best. So definitely get on that if you haven't heard it before, and if you are just interested in general in checking out more jazz guitar, this would be a great album to start out with. So that is my number 2 favorite album of 1965. Now for the grand reveal, this is my number 1 favorite album of 1965. All right, so my number 1 favorite album of 1965 is an album by Dionne Warwick titled Here I Am. And I'm willing to bet a lot of you have never heard of this record before, but I really hope that you will check it out now. Probably my number 1 favorite songwriter of all time is Bert Bacharach, and the majority of Dionne Warwick's big hits were written by Bert Bacharach, and he also wrote a lot of the songs that were on her albums throughout the 60s and early 70s. And for this album, it's got 12 songs, and 9 of the 12 were written by Bert Bacharach, and in my opinion, this album contains some of the best music that Bert Bacharach had written throughout the 60s. It's got a couple of hits, but it's also got some really amazing deep cuts that a lot of people aren't as familiar with. And Bert's songs have been done by a lot of different artists, but I've always found that Dionne Warwick's interpretations of his songs are the best. She's got a really great way of just doing the melodies in a very straightforward way, and I always prefer to hear Bert Bacharach's songs interpreted that way because I think his sense of melody is so strong, and I think the melodies really speak for themselves. I don't think they need a lot of embellishments and a lot of added stuff on top of it, and I just love Dionne Warwick's way of just playing the melodies straight down the middle and just doing it in the most beautiful way possible. She's got a great voice, and every time she does a Bert Bacharach song, I always think her versions really stand out the most. In addition to the Bert Bacharach originals, there is also a cover of a song titled Once in a Lifetime, as well as the traditional song This Little Light of Mine, and the album concludes with a very nice interpretation of George Gershwin's song I Loves You, Porgy. And like I said, there are so many hidden Burt Bacharach gems throughout this album, but if I had to narrow it down to a couple of favorites, I would pick In Between the Heartaches, Here I Am, Don't Go Breaking My Heart, Window Wishing, Are You There With Another Girl, and How Can I Hurt You? As you can see, it's really hard for me to narrow it down to just a couple of songs because this album is just filled with so much beautiful and just incredible compositions from Burt Bacharach, and the way that Dionne Warwick interprets these songs is just perfect. It's exactly what I want to hear. And in my opinion, when you look back at all of the different collaborations that Dionne Warwick and Burt Bacharach did throughout their careers, I think this album is about as good as it gets. It contains some of my favorite deep cuts and a couple of really great hits and a couple of covers that I think are done very nicely as well, and I think it's about as close to a perfect album as it can get. My only critique of this album, if I was going to give it a very mild critique, is the production can be a little bit too raw on a couple of the songs, but again, the compositions are just so strong that I really don't let that take away from the album very much because I just love the songs so much, and if that's the only way that I can hear them with this production style, then so be it. But that is it. That is my number one favorite album of 1965, and I really hope you will check it out and let me know your thoughts. And that is it for the video today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and hopefully you have a couple of new albums to check out. And based on my preferences throughout this video, if there are any other albums that you think I may enjoy that I haven't checked out before, please leave some recommendations in the comments, and I will be sure to get to them. So to summarize, number 5 was Bert Janch, self-titled album. Number 4 was the Beatles' Rubber Soul. Number 3 was the Beach Boys' Today. Number 2 was Wes Montgomery and the Wynton Kelly Trio, Smokin' at the Half Note. And number 1 was Dionne Warwick, Here I Am. Thank you again for watching, and stay tuned for my next video, which will be the top 5 albums of 1966. I'll see you then. Take care.